A 68-year-old black woman was asked to change her seat because her skin tone didn't match the comfort zone of first class. That's not a metaphor. That's precisely what happened. One man complained, one crew member obeyed, and suddenly a quiet flight from Chicago to Atlanta became a scene from a script America keeps pretending it already finished. Her name is Chanel Carter. She wasn't disruptive. She wasn't loud. She was composed, dignified, and seated exactly where she had been assigned until someone decided she didn't belong there. But Chanel didn't stand up. She didn't move, because some seats are not just leather and aisle numbers. They are lines in the sand. And when you're a black elder who has built a life on service and survival, being told to move feels less like policy and more like history replaying itself with a polite smile. What happened next didn't just shake the cabin. It shook a country. Keep watching. This is not just a story. This is a reckoning at 35,000 feet. At 68, Chanel Carter had long mastered the art of being underestimated. She walked through the terminal of O'Hare International Airport like any other older black woman on a weekday morning. No entourage, no jewelry, no visible power. Just a canvas tote bag on one shoulder, a pair of soft-soled walking shoes, and a quiet posture that suggested she had spent a lifetime waiting politely for space in rooms that never quite belonged to her. No one noticed her, and that was precisely the point. Today, she wasn't arriving as a board member. She wasn't announcing her presence with a press release or a glossy brochure about diversity. She was flying coach, deliberately, dressed like the America that still gets overlooked. Chanel Carter, co-owner of nearly 1/5 of Atlantic Sky's Airlines, was about to step into the belly of the very system she helped finance, not to inspect, but to remember, because memory never fades when it's stitched into your skin. She was 11 the first time she learned what it meant to be politely erased. Her mother, a housekeeper who had saved 6 months' wages to take her daughter on their first flight, had worn a simple navy dress and borrowed shoes. Chanel had dressed up too, clutching a plastic purse and a homemade sandwich wrapped in wax paper. They had arrived early, full of excitement, but before they could sit, a gate agent had approached, smiling too widely, speaking too softly, asking her mother if she'd be willing to give up her seat for a more frequent traveler. The traveler was white, well-dressed, late. Her mother didn't argue. She smiled back. She stood. And Chanel, 11 years old and watching everything, had felt something inside her cave in and go silent. No one in the waiting area met their eyes. No one ever did. That moment never left her. It followed her through nursing school, through city council hearings where she sat in back rows, through years of watching others speak louder and be heard faster. It followed her, even when she bought into Atlantic Skies, not out of ambition, but out of something colder, older, rage, sculpted into resolve. She had built her stake in silence, acquired shares slowly, strategically, until her vote at the table could swing policy. But she had never spoken publicly. Not once had she reminded the world of who she was, because power that must declare itself is already weak. And so today, when she boarded Flight 227, no one recognized her. Not the flight attendant who glanced at her and assumed she was lost. Not the passenger who muttered under his breath when she sat beside him. Not the service manager who would later suggest gently, with corporate polish, that perhaps she'd be more comfortable elsewhere. What they saw was just another old black woman. What they didn't see was the reckoning walking down the aisle. Because today wasn't just a flight. It was a return. A return to that gate in 1975. A return to the memory that taught her silence. But this time, she wasn't 11, and she wasn't getting up. By the time the plane landed, a cell phone video would have already gone viral. By the time the board met that evening, 5 employees would be suspended. By the end of the week, justice for Chanel would be a rallying cry. And by the end of the month, the airline would unveil the most significant customer dignity policy overhaul in its history. Elder Dignity, named in her honor. But all of that came later. For now, Chanel Carter sat still, steady and silent in seat 3C, her shoulders relaxed, her eyes forward, her entire life folding quietly into one final refusal. I will not move. Not this time. Not ever again. No one looked twice when she shuffled into the terminal. Just another older woman in worn slacks and a faded coat, her steps soft, her voice lower than the buzz of the overhead announcements. Her shoes were the kind you wore if your knees hurt, and your pride had already learned to step aside. Her hands were callous, her bag canvas, not fashionable, not expensive, familiar, dismissible. And that was precisely what she intended. Chanel Carter didn't need to pretend. She simply stripped away everything the world used to respect her. No jewelry, no title, no assistant trailing behind. She moved through O'Hare International like smoke through cracks, seen only if someone chose to look. No one did. And yet, she saw everything. She boarded the flight as a test, but not the kind you grade with charts. This wasn't about efficiency or hospitality scores. This was about something colder, deeper, and far more revealing how her airline, the one she had invested in, the one she partly owned, treated people who looked like her when they weren't rich, weren't famous, weren't loud, just ordinary. Years ago, she'd made herself a silent promise. If she ever had the power, she would walk back into the rooms that once ignored her, and she would do it without announcing who she'd become. Today was the day she kept that promise. But Chanel wasn't coming back for revenge. She came back for the truth. The kind of truth that doesn't show up in boardroom slides. The type you only see when no one thinks you matter. At the check-in counter, the agent smiled at the white couple in front of her, offered to carry their bags, and joked about their vacation. When it was Chanel's turn, the smile faded. Her ID was examined more thoroughly, and her tone elicited clipped replies, no eye contact, no warmth. Just a transactional scan, like checking for a forgery. At security, she was pulled aside for a random check. She said nothing. She had learned years ago that speaking back only lengthened the wait. At the gate, she asked gently if boarding had begun. The attendant looked over her shoulder before answering. Then, with forced patience, I told her she could sit over there until called. Over there meant a worn seat near the trash bin, away from the glass windows and sunlight. Chanel Saturday quietly. As always, no one knew she was watching. Documenting. Not with a notebook, but with memory sharpened by decades of silence. Every tone, every pause, every double standard is spoken between the lines. It was all there. On board, she had paid for a seat in business class. No one believed her. The flight attendant double-checked, then triple-checked. A second attendant was called to verify the information. She watched as they whispered, glancing at her coat, her shoes, her skin. Not one of them asked how she was doing. Not one offered help. Not one smiled. She watched the man beside her receive a welcome drink and a hot towel before takeoff. She received a glance and silence. She asked once softly about a blanket. The answer came curt. We'll get to you when we can. She waited. It never came. But this wasn't new. Chanel had seen this choreography her whole life, the slow, graceful erosion of dignity. Not loud, not blatant, just enough to remind you that you were lucky to be there at all, that you should not ask for more. She remembered her mother's shoulders, tense but proud, waiting by a gate with a child too afraid to ask why they'd been skipped over. She remembered how silence became survival, and how survival became policy, and how policy became culture. But not today. Today, she wasn't just watching for herself. She was watching for every elder who still took insults with a tired smile, for every woman who aged into invisibility, for every black passenger who booked the ticket but still had to prove they belonged. By the time the cabin doors closed, Chanel had seen enough, not to complain, to transform. She didn't need to raise her voice. She just needed to feel the truth, one last time, raw and unfiltered. Because change that matters doesn't come from above. It rises from the aisle. She looked out the window. The city faded. Her resolve didn't. Tomorrow, she would rewrite what respect means in the sky. But today, she sat quietly in her seat, carrying every wound that never got a name and preparing to give them one. She had just lowered herself into seat 3C, placed her tote bag neatly under the seat in front of her, and reached for her belt when the first disruption came. A young, stiff, and suspicious flight attendant approached her with an air of misplaced authority. "Excuse me, ma'am. May I see your boarding pass?" The tone wasn't curious. It was rehearsed. Coded. Chanel Carter held back the urge to sigh. She had been through this too many times in too many forms. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket and handed the pass over with a measured calm. The attendant examined it for far too long, her eyes darting between the paper and Chanel's face like something didn't add up. Then she walked away without comment. Chanel tried to shake it off, but her body had already tensed. She was not surprised. She was prepared. She just wasn't expecting it to escalate so quickly. Moments later, a man appeared at her row, mid-50s, expensive blazer, loud perfume, and the kind of expression that already assumed he was right. "I think you're in my seat," he said flatly. Chanel didn't look up right away. She took a breath, then replied with quiet clarity, "This is 3C. I confirmed it." The man frowned deeper, glancing around like he expected someone to back him up. "I've flown this airline for years. That's my seat." His voice was louder now, drawing glances. Chanel looked him in the eye. "You may have flown for years, sir. I own part of this airline." The man didn't laugh. He didn't scoff. He simply looked past her, pretending she hadn't spoken at all. Another flight attendant appeared. The same one. The same hesitation. "Ma'am, there seems to be a seating conflict. Would you mind stepping aside for just a moment while we sort this out?" Chanel held his gaze. "There is no conflict. My boarding pass is valid. I am seated correctly." The attendant's smile stiffened. Before he could reply, a woman seated nearby leaned over and muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, "He just doesn't want to sit next to her. That's what this is." The air froze. Chanel turned toward the woman, startled. "Excuse me?" The woman shrugged. "That's what he said when you sat down. He doesn't want to sit next to you." There was no hiding now. The man didn't deny it. He looked away, tapping his phone with exaggerated irritation. The flight attendant leaned in again. "Ma'am, to avoid any further escalation, would you be open to changing seats?" Chanel's throat tightened. "So, let me understand. A man refuses to sit next to me. I've done absolutely nothing wrong, but I'm the one being asked to move." The attendant glanced around nervously. "Please, keep your voice down." Chanel kept it steady. "My voice is not the issue." She turned toward the other passengers, now staring. "Let's name what's happening. He is uncomfortable sitting next to a black woman. Rather than addressing his prejudice, this airline is asking me to absorb it. That's not customer service. That's complicity." The cabin held its breath. The man still said nothing. The attendant stood frozen. Another staff member arrived. Then another, whispering, deflecting, apologizing, but never to her. Still, no one acknowledged what had been said. No one asked how she felt. No one considered the cruelty of asking a woman who had helped fund this very airline to step aside for the comfort of a bigot. Chanel sat still. She wasn't afraid. She was exhausted. Her silence wasn't a surrender. It was armor. "I'm not moving," she said clearly, not raising her voice, but allowing every syllable to fall heavy. "Not this time." They stared at her, powerless. One staff member offered to move the man instead. He refused. "I'll wait for the next flight," he said curtly. "Good," Chanel replied. "Then wait." A woman in the back began filming. Another passenger murmured support. The temperature in the cabin shifted. The lie of neutrality was shattered. And still, no apology came. Chanel didn't expect one. This wasn't new. This was a pattern, just louder today. She looked out the window, jaw set, hands folded. This seat, this confrontation, this moment, it wasn't a scene. It was a mirror, and everyone on that plane had to face it. She was no longer the 11-year-old who had once watched her mother give up a seat in silence. She was the woman who stayed seated, who owned the seat, who owned her story, and who, matter the discomfort it caused others, refused to move again. The video was only 91 seconds long. No violence, no shouting, just an elderly black woman sitting in silence, refusing to move. Her voice was calm, her words were sharp, her dignity is unshakable. And yet, in that minute and a half, something shifted. A crack appeared in the surface of everyday America, a fracture so precise it hit bone. It began with a single upload, shaky vertical footage posted by a young woman seated 5 rows behind. No edits, no filters, just the truth. Chanel Carter was asked to leave her seat, not because of any wrongdoing, but because a man didn't want to sit next to her. Her refusal was not dramatic. It was measured, unwavering. "I'm not moving," she said. That was it. That was the match. And the world had just been soaked in gasoline. Within hours, the video surged across platforms. TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, it didn't matter the space. Her face was there. The frame of a quiet black woman gripping her armrest as staff surrounded her. The calm refusal, the shame that did not belong to her, the silence of passengers, the flight attendant's weak apology to the man. People didn't just watch. They felt. They remembered. They recognized. For some, it was their grandmother. For others, their mother. For many, it was themselves. Veterans commented, saying they had fought for a country that still asked their sisters to move. Nurses, teachers, retired postal workers all chimed in. Black women shared their own stories, some dating back 40 years, others from just last week. "This happened to me in 1986. This happened to me in 2022. I never said anything, but I'll say it now." A storm erupted. The hashtag bearing her name became a movement, not a trend, a reckoning. Students skipped class to march. Protesters gathered outside airline offices. Former employees started talking. Bias training that was never enforced. Reports that were buried. Complaints were brushed aside because we didn't want to escalate. But now, escalation was everywhere. Comment sections are flooded. Influencers turned down sponsorships. Celebrities went live demanding accountability. Mayors issued statements. Congress members weighed in. The silence had been broken, and the sound that followed was not polite. The original airline attempted to manage the situation, releasing a brief statement regarding the internal investigation and passenger satisfaction. But the people were done with statements. They wanted soul. They wanted the truth. They wanted to see someone in power stand up, not hide behind press releases. But Chanel Carter did not speak. Not yet. She let the world speak for her, and it did. Her photo was projected on the side of a Harlem building. A street artist in Oakland painted her with a crown. Chicago renamed a library reading room in her honor. Talk shows played her clip in slow motion, voice steady. "I'm not moving." Those 3 words are now printed on shirts, banners, and signs held at airports and town halls across the country. They had been said before, by others, in other seats, on other buses, in courtrooms, in voting booths. But this time, they were caught on camera, in the sterile silence of a business class cabin, where class could not protect her, and where her refusal exposed a system still profoundly sick. And perhaps that's why the video struck so deep, because she wasn't poor, wasn't rude, wasn't unprepared. She had done everything right, and still, she was asked to move. Still, her presence was called a problem. That undeniable, uncomfortable truth cracked through the polite fiction of progress. It made people face what they wanted to forget. That, for some, no amount of achievement will ever be enough. That racism doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers behind a pressed uniform. By the end of the day, 38 million had seen it. The next morning, schools were using it in ethics lessons. Churches played it before sermons. Airlines held emergency board meetings. And still, Chanel Carter remained quiet. She had said enough. The world was echoing it back. This wasn't just a moment. It was a mirror, and millions of people had finally looked in. It wasn't announced with a press release. There was no countdown, no press run, no polished PR campaign. Just a sudden stream, a quiet notification, a plain white podium against a deep navy backdrop. The logo of Atlantic Skies is in the corner, and standing behind the microphone was a man who had long been invisible by design. Daniel Whitmore had been CEO for over a decade, the kind who rarely appeared in public, who spoke in earnings calls, not to people, who hired people to protect his brand while remaining untouched by the impact of his policies. But that day, when he stepped into the camera's frame, there was something different in his face. The poise was gone. What remained was a quiet man under the weight of truth. He took a moment before speaking. When he did, the first words fell like glass breaking on marble. Her name is Chanel Carter. He paused. She is a shareholder of this company. She is a former nurse. She is a mother, a grandmother, a woman who has lived through decades of change and still has to fight for basic dignity at 35,000 feet. And we failed her. No spin, no denial, just that. What happened on that flight, he continued, was not a mistake. It was the result of a system designed to protect comfort over accountability, a culture that asks Black women to be gracious in the face of rudeness, that asks older people to be patient with being ignored, that allows bigotry to dress itself in the language of preference. We asked Miss Carter to move because another man was uncomfortable. He was not in danger. He was not mistreated. He was simply uncomfortable. And we treated his discomfort as more valid than her humanity. He looked down then, not to read, but to gather himself. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. And the truth is, this is not about one flight. It is about the rot that lives under polished service and smiling uniforms. We taught our staff to prioritize de-escalation, but never taught them to recognize injustice. We trained them to resolve conflict, but never to question power. We told them to keep things moving, but never asked if we were moving in the right direction. And then he did something few CEOs ever do. He took responsibility. This is on me, he said. I let it happen. I benefited from the systems that let it happen, and I refuse to hide behind corporate apologies. He then laid out the most sweeping reform in the airline's history, a full external investigation into discriminatory incidents over the last decade, an independent ethics board made up not of executives, but of community advocates, former passengers, and elders of color, mandatory recertification for every flight attendant and crew member, with training not designed by PR firms, but by people who have lived through marginalization and still carry grace in their bones. The most potent part of his speech wasn't in the policy. It came at the end. We asked a Black woman to move, and instead, she made us all shift. He nodded once, then stepped away. No questions, no applause, just silence. But the world heard him. That night, the video of his speech aired, beside the original footage of Chanel Carter on the flight. People watched them side by side. In one, she sat still. In the other, the most powerful man in the company stood humbled. The contrast was stunning. A woman who never raised her voice had moved an entire system. A refusal to budge had made giants kneel. But what came next was even more unexpected. Atlantic Skies appointed Chanel Carter as head of a newly formed Passenger Dignity Council, a paid role, not symbolic, not ceremonial, real power. She would review complaints, rebuild policy, retrain those who had once overlooked her. She accepted with a single sentence, I'm not here to shame, I'm here to shape. At the first employee summit, she didn't stand on the stage. She sat on a simple chair in the middle of the room. Staff gathered around her like students around a fire. She didn't lecture, she told stories. Of her mother being told to move seats in 1971. Of how she said nothing at 11. Of how it still lived in her chest like a bruise that never faded. And then, quietly, she said, I never thought I'd live long enough to be asked to help fix the very thing that once made me feel small. No one breathed. Some cried. That day, they didn't just listen. They remembered. And change, real change, began. Because in a world that tries to move women like her aside, she stayed seated. And because she stayed, everything else had to move. They gave her a seat. Not at the head of the boardroom table, not in the spotlight of a press conference, but in the middle of the reform, the eye of the storm she had quietly created. Chanel Carter did not walk into that first council meeting with a mission to prove anything to anyone. She walked in as a woman who had nothing to gain and everything to give. No one clapped when she entered. No one quite knew how to greet her. She was not an executive. She wasn't a lawyer or a trained diversity expert. But everyone in that room knew she had already done what none of them had been able to do. She had changed the company's trajectory without ever raising her voice. She sat down without ceremony. She placed a small notepad on the table and a pen beside it. No assistants, no slideshow, no pitch deck, just her presence. That first meeting of the Passenger Dignity Council was filled with tension, mostly unspoken. Employees who had worked there for decades glanced at each other, unsure how to engage. Some still quietly questioned why she was chosen. Others waited to see if she'd lash out, demand apologies, punish those who failed her. She did none of that. Instead, she began with a story. When I was 11, she said softly, I watched my mother be asked to leave her seat on a bus because her clothes looked too poor. She said nothing. She just stood. And she paused, eyes steady. I said nothing too, and I've been carrying that silence ever since. There were no charts, no corporate jargon, just that. In the weeks that followed, Chanel didn't dominate meetings. She reshaped them. She replaced metrics with meaning. She asked simple questions that forced uncomfortable honesty. When crew members asked how they should handle passenger conflict, she replied, start by asking who's expected to stay silent. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did say, her words moved like slow water, gentle, steady, unstoppable. Under her guidance, the airline's training program underwent a transformation. Instead of role-playing mechanical scripts, flight attendants now sat in circles, reading real letters written by passengers who had experienced humiliation. The goal was not to memorize a protocol, but to feel a pattern. She once said, the human body recognizes disrespect faster than it registers turbulence. The room fell silent. No one forgot that line. She didn't advocate for punishment. She insisted on accountability. I'm not here to get people fired, she told a skeptical executive, but I won't protect a culture that makes dignity negotiable. That line was incorporated into the training manual. Chanel also visited airports. Quietly, she sat in the waiting area, talked to janitors, listened to elderly travelers who felt invisible in business class. She took notes, never names. She wasn't collecting stories to weaponize them. She was collecting truths to rebuild a standard. Her leadership style disarmed cynicism. She didn't demand that people become perfect. She asked them to become aware. If you've ever looked away when someone was mistreated, she said in one workshop, that moment doesn't define you. What you do next does. That line ended up printed on posters across employee lounges nationwide. And yet, she stayed humble. When a journalist tried to label her the airline whisperer, she shook her head and replied, I'm not here to whisper to power. I'm here so people like me never have to whisper again. The CEO, Daniel Whitmore, who had once ruled through distance, now sat beside her in many meetings, taking notes. She teaches without preaching, he admitted during one quarterly town hall. She leads from the middle of the room. That phrase caught on. The middle of the room became a symbol inside the company. Not the front, not the back, but the still center where transformation happens. Months passed. Reports showed improved customer satisfaction, with fewer complaints, but beyond numbers, something deeper shifted. Crew members greeted passengers differently. Elderly travelers were no longer treated as logistical challenges, but as honored guests. Racial complaints dropped, not because people stopped caring, but because staff started noticing sooner. At one point, a young employee, freshly hired and unaware of Chanel's full story, asked her why she never raised her voice in meetings. She smiled and said, because I've already raised generations, and they heard me just fine. The room, again, went quiet. This was her power, not dominance. not charisma, not some clever campaign, but the stillness of someone who had been forced to move for others too many times and had now chosen to sit still so everyone else would have to adjust. She once lost her voice in silence as a child. Now she had turned silence into strategy, memory into momentum, and a chair that once symbolized shame into a seat of transformation. And still, she never asked to be thanked. Because when you change a system from within, the applause isn't the point. The point is that no one else gets asked to move again. She was never meant to be a hero, not the kind you read about in books or see on screens. She was a grandmother, a retired nurse, and a quiet woman who had long learned how to navigate the world without making waves. But on that day, on that plane, she didn't move, and everything changed. What began as a single refusal grew into something neither she nor the world expected. Chanel Carter hadn't spoken out to become a movement. She had simply stayed in her seat, dignified and still, and in doing so, reminded a world of noise that sometimes the most significant force is silence with purpose. Months passed, policies changed, executives stepped down, new systems were built. But beyond the headlines, something deeper shifted, a reckoning in the hearts of those who had watched her, especially among people her age, those in their 50 seconds, 60 seconds, 70 seconds, who had carried their own stories of being told to move, to wait, to shrink. They watched Chanel, not as a stranger, but as a reflection of themselves. Her stillness called forth decades of buried memory, the things they hadn't said, the seats they'd given up, the dignity they'd swallowed to stay safe, stay seen, stay alive. She had sat still for them, too. At a community center in Chicago's South Side, an older woman stood during a local gathering and said, "I never told anyone, but they asked me to move from the front of the church once. Said my dress was too plain. I was 14. I just smiled and moved. Watching Miss Carter, I finally cried for that little girl in me." It wasn't just about race, or age, or even that airline. It was about recognition. That someone had finally stayed put long enough for the world to see what it meant to be displaced again and again, in small and large ways, and say, "No more." Chanel never raised her voice. She never chased cameras. When they asked her how she stayed so calm, she said, "Because I've lived through worse, and I'm still here." And when they asked what she hoped people would remember, she paused for a long moment before answering, "That sitting still is not the same as doing nothing. Sometimes it's the bravest thing you can do." She never gave speeches. She gave presence. When she walked into a room, the energy shifted, not from fear, but from reverence. People straightened their backs, listened more carefully, held their words just a second longer, not because she demanded it, but because her story made people want to be better in her presence. And maybe that's what dignity is. Not just the right to be treated well, but the ability to make others treat the world differently by how you exist within it. One afternoon, nearly a year after the incident, the airline hosted a small private ceremony. No press, no hashtags, just staff, passengers, elders, and a few empty seats. One of those seats had a plaque that simply read, "Reserved for the one who stayed." When Chanel arrived, she didn't sit in it. She walked past it, placed her hand gently on the back of the chair, and looked out at the room. "I don't need a seat anymore," she said quietly, "because now you all know how to make space." That line, delivered without performance, was enough to still the air. No one applauded. No one needed to. Because in that moment, everyone present understood something sacred had been said. And that's how history changed. Not with banners or marches, though those things matter. Not with anger or protest alone, though they have their place. But with one woman in her late 60s, holding her ground at 35,000 feet. Not to fight, but to remind. Remind us that age does not diminish value. That dignity cannot be negotiated. That silence, when rooted in truth, becomes the most powerful voice in the room. So if you ask what happened to Chanel Carter after the cameras turned away, the answer is simple. She didn't move. And because she didn't, everything else had to. Chanel Carter did not stand on a stage or hold a microphone. She did not raise her fist or shout into the void. She simply stayed in her seat. And by doing so, she invited the rest of us to look inward, to ask ourselves how often we have moved, not because we wanted to, but because the world expected us to. Her story is not loud, but it is unforgettable. It is a reminder that stillness, when rooted in truth, can be noisier than any protest. This moment did not begin on that plane. It started long before, in years of learned silence, in times when people like Chanel were taught to step aside. But this time, someone stayed. And because she stayed, systems shifted, conversations deepened, and dignity was restored to its rightful place at the center. She did not ask for attention. She commanded presence not by force, but by living with such quiet conviction that we could not help but listen. If this story moved you, do not let that feeling fade. Let it move through you. Let it open a memory or a question you have kept inside too long. Share this video with someone who needs to remember their worth. Tell us your thoughts in the comments. Tell us when you, too, stayed still for what was right. And if you want more stories that matter, that honor the truths we carry and the voices we've inherited, please subscribe to our channel. Stay with us, because the work of remembering, of reflecting, of rebuilding is not done. Thank you for watching. May you carry it forward in the way you speak, the way you see others, and the way you choose to sit still when it matters most. May your day be filled with quiet courage and the strength to stay rooted in your dignity.